When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. No one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores.
I'm Mark Takahashi, and this is my family's story of the Japanese internment during World War II. My grandfather, on my mother's side, Toyo Miyatake, he was born in the late 1890s in the southern islands of Japan. He settled in Los Angeles in 1908. He opened up his own photo studio, did a lot of Hollywood backgrounder type headshots. He was kind of a bohemian, which was rare for the Japanese community. My paternal side of the family, the Takahashi side, my grandfather, Seytsu Takahashi, he came to the US in the early 1930s, settled in Los Angeles, and he was a Buddhist reverend. He was sort of a community leader in a lot of ways. He was very prominent. He did a lot to try and keep some of the kids off the street. He founded a Boy Scout troop. He was part of this naval association that would help feed some of these starving Japanese sailors who were having a tough time once they got to LA. It had nothing to do with military or the Japanese Imperial Navy.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone.
2 months after Pearl Harbor, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which rounded up Japanese Americans, and they were sent to relocation camps around the country, and they spent the duration of the war in those relocation and concentration camps. Toyo got sent to Manzanar relocation camp, which is about 220 miles outside of LA in the Owens Valley. And when they showed up to Manzanar, the facilities were very, very primitive. 2x4 framed structures, and the only walls were tar paper. We're talking February, March. It was bitterly cold, and that cold would just seep through every crack of those buildings.
It was hot in the summer, bone-chilling in the winter, and there was always the wind. There was always the wind.
On December 7, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterward.
When Pearl Harbor hit, Seytsu was labeled an enemy alien because of his ties to the Naval Association and as a community organizer. They processed him as a criminal. They sent him to jail. Seytsu's wife, Suzue, my grandmother, was pregnant with one of their children. She had to pack everything up, and she was shipped off initially to Santa Anita Racetrack. She was 3 months pregnant at the time, and they put her in a dirty horse stall, which probably isn't good for a pregnant woman. Seytsu, after he was imprisoned, he was put on a train with other high-risk detainees, as they were labeled. Eventually, he ended up in Louisiana, and at the same time, my grandmother, his wife, was in Arkansas. As an artist and photographer, Toyo felt a compulsion to document what was happening, but he was forbidden to have any cameras with him. He actually smuggled in a film holder and a lens, and in camp he built a box that looked sort of like a lunchbox. It would open up on one flap and there would be the lens. It was on a pipe so he can unscrew it to focus and would click the shutter and then go on his way. He was doing that for a while and then finally got caught. The camp director, Ralph Merritt, was sympathetic to the cause and allowed him not just to shoot, but sort of made him the official camp photographer. He set up kind of a studio in camp and would shoot portraits. He would shoot weddings. He would shoot funerals. He was documenting just life in general behind the wires. At the time my grandfather was allowed to shoot in Manzanar, there was another photographer who was making the trek between LA and the Sierras. That photographer was Ansel Adams. He heard that there was another photographer behind the concentration camp, and he decided to visit, and they became good friends. He started shooting with my grandfather in Manzanar. And after the war, Ansel Adams was sort of like an uncle to my mother and her brothers. Just before their death in the late 70s, they published a book called Two Views of Manzanar, which showed their works side by side. There's a distinct change from his style. It was a lot more artistic before the war, and during the war, it was very much more documentarian. It was people out in the field farming, or people proud of the bounty of the harvest. It's children lining up for their toy allocation. It's Christmas time where they have a quasi-Santa Claus show up. It was really just showing what life is like, what families went through, almost showing that it was more normal than you might think. My Aunt Nancy was born in camp, and my grandfather actually didn't even get to meet her until she was 3 years old. There was one moment where he was allowed to visit my grandmother and the family in Arkansas. During that time, my grandmother was petitioning the government to reunite the family, and on her behalf, the Spanish government, which was neutral during the war, was also petitioning to reunite the family. He was allowed to go to Arkansas to visit because his youngest son fell gravely ill. They thought he was going to die. They shipped him up there. He was only allowed to stay for 3 days. He wasn't allowed to touch his son. He could only see his son through a glass partition. And then he was shipped right back. After a certain amount of time, they finally reunited the family at the last camp, which was in Crystal City, Texas, which was deemed a camp for high-risk detainee families. They remained in Crystal City until the end of the war. After the war ended, I finally got back to Los Angeles, and the government wanted to deport him because he was still labeled an enemy alien. Fortunately, the community banded together and petitioned in his favor, and he was allowed to stay. My grandfather became a bishop in the Buddhist church and then an abbot just before his death in the early 80s. The Miyatake side didn't suffer nearly as much as a lot of the other people in the community. Fortunately for Toyo, he had a lot of Caucasian and other friends in the arts community that held on to his property, his studio as well as his house. So after the war ended, he still had a place to live and his business could reopen. They got back to LA and they resettled back in their house in Boyle Heights and reopened the studio in Little Tokyo. They did their best to get the community back up and running. After the war and after they were resettled, their opinions of America on the whole didn't really change. They were Americans before, they were Americans after.